I never considered myself a handyman, but over the years, I'd learned enough to get by. When the call came in, it was from an old friend, or rather, a friend of a friend, a woman named Clara. She lived on the other side of town, in an old apartment that, according to her, was falling apart faster than my patience. I didn't ask too many questions. I had the time, and I always believed in helping where I could. When I arrived at her building, I was greeted by a stubborn front door that took 3 solid knocks before it creaked open. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. She was a striking woman, not in the conventional sense, but in a way that made you take a second look. Her dark eyes held a sharpness, a self-assurance that suggested she was used to handling things on her own. "You must be the handyman," she said, one eyebrow lifting. I chuckled, stepping inside. "Not quite. Just someone who knows how to fix things." The apartment was small, but had character. Brick walls, large windows with peeling paint, and a faint scent of old books and something floral I couldn't quite place. She led me through a narrow hallway into the main room, pointing out the issues as we went. A leaking faucet, a broken cabinet hinge, a light switch that sparked if you looked at it wrong. "How long have these been like this?" I asked, rolling up my sleeves. "Long enough," she admitted. "But I had other priorities." Something in the way she said it made me curious, but I didn't pry. Instead, I got to work, unaware that this would be the beginning of something far more complicated than a few home repairs. The work took longer than expected. What started as a simple list of repairs turned into an all-day project. The cabinet hinge turned out to be more stubborn than I thought. The faucet needed a part that required a quick trip to the hardware store, and the flickering light wasn't just a switch issue, it was a whole wiring problem. Clara hovered nearby, watching me work. She wasn't the type to offer small talk, but every now and then she'd make a dry remark that made me chuckle. When I finally tightened the last screw on the cabinet, I leaned back and stretched my sore arms. "All done," I announced. She inspected my work, nodding approvingly. "Not bad. Looks like you actually know what you're doing." I smirked. "I told you." I started gathering my tools, expecting her to ask how much she owed me. Instead, she leaned against the counter, arms folded, a slow smile forming on her lips. "So," she said, tilting her head, "how do you feel about a different kind of payment?" I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked past me into the small living room, picking up a record from a messy stack and sliding it onto a vintage turntable. The sound of an old jazz melody filled the space. She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Stay for dinner," she said, "and maybe a little more." There was something in the air, an unspoken challenge, a test of sorts. I wasn't sure what game she was playing, but I had the feeling that whatever it was, I wasn't the first to be invited to play. I hesitated. The logical part of me told me to thank her for the offer and go home. But curiosity had a way of getting the better of me. "All right," I said finally, setting my toolbox down. "Let's see what you're cooking." Her smile deepened, but there was something else behind it, something I couldn't quite place. Something that told me this was only the beginning. Clara moved around the kitchen with a confidence that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing, though the way she glanced at the spice rack like it held secrets told me she wasn't much of a cook. "You cook often?" I asked, leaning against the counter. She scoffed. "Not if I can help it." That made me laugh. "Then what exactly did I agree to?" She smirked over her shoulder. "An experience." The way she said it made me curious. I watched as she pulled ingredients from the fridge, a bottle of wine, some vegetables, a steak still wrapped in its butcher paper. I had expected something simple, maybe a boxed meal, but she was going for the real deal. As she started chopping, I took a seat at the small table in the corner, letting the jazz from the record player fill the silence. There was something intimate about the way the room felt. Warm light bouncing off the exposed brick, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board, the occasional glance she threw my way as if to make sure I was still watching. "I don't do this often," she admitted after a while. "Cook for people?" She shook her head. "Have people stay?" I nodded slowly. There was something about Clara, something guarded, like she only let people see what she wanted them to. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she moved, the way she kept a certain distance even in a small apartment. "So why me?" I asked, watching as she poured 2 glasses of wine. She hesitated, then placed a glass in front of me. "You helped me out," she said simply. "And I like to be fair." It wasn't a real answer, but I let it go. As the food cooked, she settled across from me, propping her chin in her hand. "So tell me," she said, her voice teasing, "what's the catch?" I raised an eyebrow. "Catch? Guys like you don't just fix things for free. You're either really nice or really bored." I took a slow sip of my wine, considering her words. "Maybe both." She studied me for a moment before shaking her head. "Nah, I don't buy it." I laughed. "Well, you don't have to. You're already paying me." Her smirk returned. "Yeah, I suppose I am." Dinner was surprisingly good. Whatever doubts I had about her cooking skills disappeared with the first bite. We ate, talked, and somewhere along the way, the unspoken tension between us grew thicker, like a rope slowly tightening. After we finished, I leaned back in my chair, watching as she picked up the plates and carried them to the sink. "I guess that settles our deal," I said. She glanced at me over her shoulder, a glint in her eyes. "Not quite." I frowned slightly. "No." She wiped her hands on a towel and walked toward me, stopping just close enough that I could smell the faint hint of her perfume beneath the scent of dinner. "I said dinner and more, remember?" I looked up at her, waiting. "Follow me," she said softly, turning toward the hallway. For a brief moment, I considered the choices in front of me. There was something about her, something that made me feel like I was stepping into unfamiliar territory, and yet I still stood. And then, without another word, I followed. I followed Clara down the dimly lit hallway, the soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath our feet the only sound between us. The air in the apartment felt different now, thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. She led me to a small room at the end of the hall, pausing just long enough to glance over her shoulder before pushing the door open. The room was unexpected. It wasn't a bedroom, like I had assumed. Instead, it looked more like a workspace. A long wooden table sat against one wall, scattered with tools and half-finished projects. Shelves lined with books and small trinkets hugged the corners of the room, while a single lamp cast a warm glow over everything. I took a step inside, my eyes roaming over the space. "This isn't what I expected." Clara leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And what exactly were you expecting?" I glanced at her. "I'm not sure yet." She smirked, then walked over to the table, running her fingers across the surface. "This is what I really do," she said. "Fixing things. Or at least trying to." I looked closer. The projects on the table varied. An old clock missing its hands, a broken ceramic vase held together by fragile seams of glue, a music box with its lid detached. Each piece looked carefully handled, as if she was trying to put the past back together one object at a time. "You like fixing things," I said. She shrugged. "More than breaking them." Something about the way she said it made me pause. There was weight behind those words, something unspoken. I reached for the broken music box, turning it over in my hands. "And this?" she sighed. "That one's been giving me trouble. It was my grandmother's." Stopped playing years ago. I opened the lid, examining the tiny gears inside. A simple mechanism, but delicate. Mind if I take a look? She hesitated, then nodded. Be my guest. I set my glass of wine down and got to work, carefully adjusting the inner workings of the box. It took time, more time than I expected, but eventually, with a careful twist of the key, a soft melody filled the space. Clara's eyes widened slightly as the familiar tune played. She didn't say anything at first, just listened, her fingers brushing lightly over the worn edges of the box. I didn't think it could be fixed, she murmured. I smiled. Sometimes things just need a little patience. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time since I arrived, her guarded expression softened. There was something else there now, something quieter, more vulnerable. You surprise me, she admitted. I leaned back against the table. Good or bad? She tilted her head. Still deciding. A comfortable silence settled between us. The melody from the music box played on, filling the air with something almost nostalgic. Then, as if deciding something for herself, Clara reached for my hand, her fingers brushing against mine. Come on, she said, her voice quieter now. Let's sit for a while. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let her lead me back to the living room, where the jazz record had long since finished playing. She poured us both another glass of wine, and we sat together on the worn-out couch, the night stretching before us like an unanswered question. For the first time, I wasn't in a hurry to find the answer. The wine was smooth, the kind that made time stretch and words flow easier. We sat on the couch, neither of us in a rush to fill the silence. Clara rested one elbow on the armrest, turning the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. The lamp beside us cast a warm, golden glow over her face, making her look softer, less guarded. So, she finally said, breaking the quiet, do you always fix things for people and refuse to take their money? I smirked. Not always. But tonight you did. I shrugged. Didn't seem right to charge you. She raised an eyebrow. And why's that? I took a sip of my wine, watching her over the rim of the glass. Because you're different. She let out a soft, amused laugh. Different how? I haven't figured that out yet, I admitted. She leaned back, studying me like I was one of the broken things on her work table. You're not what I expected either, she said. Most guys wouldn't have spent their whole evening fixing up an apartment for a woman they just met. They would have taken the first excuse to leave. I glanced at her. Did you want me to leave? There was a pause. Then, without looking at me, she said, No. That single word carried more weight than it should have. I set my glass down on the coffee table, turning slightly to face her. So, Clara, I said, mirroring her earlier words. What's the catch? She exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You're really asking me that? I am. She tilted her head, her dark eyes locked on mine. What if I told you I don't believe in simple transactions? I thought about that for a moment. You mean things should be more than just a trade? Exactly. She rested her chin on her hand. Dinner was a thank you, sure. But maybe I was also testing something. I frowned slightly. Testing what? She hesitated, then said, You? That took me by surprise. Me? Clara gave a slow nod. People always want something. And I wanted to see if you were patient enough to wait for the real offer. I leaned forward, intrigued. And what's the real offer? She placed her glass on the table and turned toward me, her knee barely brushing against mine. Stay, she said simply. I blinked. Stay? Like tonight? She shook her head. Longer. A week. Maybe more. I studied her carefully. There was no teasing in her expression, no flirtation in her tone. She was serious. "Why?" I asked. She looked down for a moment, as if weighing how much to say. Then she sighed and met my gaze again. "Because I think you could fix more than just my apartment." The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to ask what she meant, what exactly she needed fixing. But something told me that was a conversation for another time. Instead, I asked, "And what do I get in return?" Clara's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You'll find out. A test. A challenge." And for some reason, I wasn't ready to walk away from it. I picked up my wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid inside. Then, without breaking eye contact, I said, "All right. I'll stay." Her smile deepened, but there was something else behind it, something unreadable. Something that told me I had just agreed to something far more complicated than I realized. The next morning, I woke up to the scent of coffee and the distant sound of running water. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the weight of a warm blanket over me, none of it belonged to my world. Clara's world. I sat up on the small couch, stretching out the stiffness in my back. I had planned to leave the night before, but then she had made her offer. Stay. A week, maybe more. The challenge in her voice, the unspoken mystery behind her request, had kept me there. I swung my feet to the floor and followed the scent of coffee to the kitchen, where Clara was already dressed, her hair pulled back, a steaming mug in hand. "You're up early," she said, leaning against the counter. I nodded. "Old habit." "You?" she smirked. "Same." She slid a fresh cup toward me, and I took it, the warmth seeping into my hands. "So," I said, "what exactly does staying mean? Am I just an in-house handyman, or do I get a real job description?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "Depends. How are you at fixing things that aren't broken yet?" I frowned. "That's a trick question." She chuckled, taking a sip of her coffee. "Maybe." There was something about the way she spoke, always leaving room for interpretation. I wasn't sure if she was testing me or trying to see how much I could figure out on my own. After breakfast, she handed me a list. Not just repairs, but tasks. Things that didn't seem urgent. Adjust the bookshelf in her room. Oil the hinges on the window. Help her move a few boxes from the storage closet. "These all seem minor," I said, scanning the list. "They are," she admitted. "But they're things I can't do alone." There it was again, that hint of something deeper, something she wasn't saying outright. I nodded. "All right. Where do we start?" The morning passed in a blur of small tasks. Some repairs, some simple chores, and the occasional quiet moment where Clara would pause, watching me with that unreadable expression before moving on. By midday, we were in her bedroom, rearranging the bookshelf she had insisted needed adjusting. "You don't seem like the type to keep a lot of books," I noted, pulling one from the shelf. She smirked. "What type is that?" "The kind that doesn't like to sit still long enough to read." She laughed softly. "I used to read more. Before life got in the way." I glanced at the book in my hand, an old, worn novel with a folded page near the middle. "You never finished this one." Clara's smile faded slightly. "No." I looked at her, waiting for more, but she just reached for another book and ran her fingers along the spine. "We all leave things unfinished sometimes," she said after a moment. It was then that I started to understand. This wasn't about bookshelves or window hinges. Clara was someone who had left parts of her life unfinished. Pieces of herself scattered in different places, waiting to be picked up. And for some reason, she had asked me to stay. That evening, after the sun had dipped below the rooftops, she poured us both another glass of wine. We sat by the window, watching the city breathe beneath us. "So," she said, turning to me, still think this was just about fixing an apartment. I exhaled a quiet laugh. Not anymore. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded, as if satisfied with that answer. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she murmured, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd made different choices?" I frowned slightly. "You mean in life?" She nodded. "Yeah. If you turned left instead of right, said yes instead of no." I thought about that for a moment. I think about it sometimes, but I try not to get stuck in it. Clara swirled her wine, watching the deep red liquid move. I get stuck in it. I glanced at her. "Is that why you asked me to stay?" She hesitated, then met my gaze. "Maybe." I wanted to ask more, to press her for answers, but something told me she would only give me as much as she was ready to. So instead, I just said, "Then I guess I'm right where I'm supposed to be." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes held something else. Something unfinished. And for the first time, I wondered if I was fixing something, or if I was becoming part of what was already broken. The days blurred together in a quiet rhythm. Mornings filled with small repairs, afternoons spent helping Clara with whatever odd task she came up with, and evenings shared over wine, conversations lingering in the dim light of her apartment. She never spoke outright about why she had asked me to stay, and I didn't push. But I started to see the cracks. She'd pause in the middle of a thought, gaze drifting to something I couldn't see. Some nights, I'd hear her footsteps pacing in the next room long after she thought I was asleep. And when she thought I wasn't looking, there was a shadow behind her eyes, something weighing her down. It wasn't just about fixing things. It was about something she had lost. It was on the fourth day that I found the lockbox. I was organizing one of the storage closets, stacking old shoeboxes and clearing out dusty corners when I saw it, tucked away behind a pile of forgotten clothes. It was small, made of dark wood with a tarnished metal latch. I picked it up, weighing it in my hands. Heavy. I brought it out into the living room, where Clara was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a box of records. She looked up as I set the lockbox down beside her. "This was in the closet," I said. "Yours?" Her entire body tensed. For the first time since I had met her, Clara didn't have a quick response. She reached for the box slowly, running her fingers over the surface like she was touching something fragile. "I thought I'd lost this," she murmured. I leaned against the couch, watching her carefully. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she unlatched it and lifted the lid. Inside were old letters, folded neatly. A few Polaroid photos. A small silver necklace tangled in its own chain. And beneath it all, a dried flower, pressed flat against the wood. Clara exhaled, her fingers hovering over the contents before picking up one of the letters. The paper was worn, edges soft from time. "You don't have to tell me," I said gently. She hesitated, then met my gaze. "No," she said. "I want to." She unfolded the letter, smoothing it out against her knee. "This was from him," she said. I didn't need to ask who. The way she said it, the weight in her voice, it told me everything. She started reading, her voice quieter now. "Clara, I know I shouldn't write, but I don't know what else to do. I still see you everywhere. In the city, in the music, in the spaces we used to fill. I don't know if I'll ever stop missing you, but I hope you're doing better than I am. Take care of yourself, okay? You always deserved more." A long silence stretched between us. Clara traced the words with her thumb, like she was trying to absorb them. "I never wrote back," she whispered. "I wanted to, but I didn't." I watched her, waiting. "He left," she said finally. "A long time ago. And I let him." She swallowed hard, setting the letter down. I told myself I didn't care, that it was better that way. But I kept all of this. I glanced at the open box. Because you did care. She let out a quiet, breathy laugh, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. I leaned forward, resting my arms on my knees. Do you still miss him? Clara didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she said, I miss the version of me I was with him. That was the most honest thing she had said since I met her. I nodded slowly. Maybe that version of you isn't gone, I said. Maybe she's just waiting for you to pick her back up. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she reached into the lockbox and pulled out the tangled necklace, rolling it between her fingers. Can you fix this? She asked softly. I took it from her, carefully working at the knots in the chain. I can try, I said. And for the first time, I thought maybe fixing things wasn't about the objects at all. Maybe it never had been. That night, Clara was quieter than usual. She didn't pour wine. She didn't put on music. Instead, she sat by the window, staring out at the city as if waiting for an answer only the skyline could give her. The lockbox sat on the coffee table, still open, its contents untouched since she had pulled out the letter. I sat across from her, working the last knot out of the necklace she had given me. The delicate silver chain slipped through my fingers, untangling piece by piece until it was whole again. I held it up. There, I said. Fixed. She turned slowly, her gaze dropping to the necklace in my palm. A long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine as she took it. Thank you, she murmured. I wasn't sure if she was thanking me for the necklace or for something else. She turned the small pendant over between her fingers before fastening it around her neck. It rested just below her collarbone, the silver catching the dim light of the room. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something. But instead, she just exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I think, she said, almost to herself, I've spent too much time holding on to the past. I leaned back, watching her. And now? She looked at me then, a small, tired smile playing at the corners of her lips. I think I'm finally ready to let go. She reached forward, closing the lid of the lockbox with a quiet click. And just like that, something between us shifted, something neither of us had the words for yet. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever she had lost, she was finally ready to start looking forward again. And maybe, just maybe, I was meant to be part of that. The next morning, the apartment felt different. Lighter. The lockbox was no longer on the coffee table. It had been tucked away, its presence no longer weighing down the space. Clara moved through the kitchen with a quiet ease, brewing coffee, humming softly under her breath. For the first time since I had arrived, she seemed at peace. I leaned against the doorway, watching her. You seem different today. She glanced at me, a small smile tugging at her lips. Maybe I am. She set a mug in front of me and sat across the table. So, she said, wrapping her hands around her own cup. How long are you really planning to stay? The question lingered between us, heavier than it should have been. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. I don't know, I admitted. I guess I hadn't thought that far ahead. She smirked. That's a first. I chuckled, shaking my head. Yeah, well, you're not exactly what I expected. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. We sat in comfortable silence, sipping our coffee, the weight of the past few days settling into something softer. Something unspoken but understood. Finally, Clara set her cup down and stretched her arms above her head. You know, she said, there's still one more thing in this apartment that needs fixing. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah. What's that? She leaned forward, resting her chin in her hand, her dark eyes glinting with something between amusement and curiosity. "Me," she said. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for my coffee, taking a slow sip before meeting her gaze. "Then I guess I'll stick around a little longer," I said. Her smile deepened, but this time there was no hesitation behind it. And just like that, the deal had changed. Because maybe, in the end, we weren't just fixing things. Maybe we were learning how to build something new. The end.